Let me remind ourselves to take a moment and cultivate bodhicitta motivation, or the altruistic motivation seeking complete enlightenment for the benefit of all other sentient beings. And with that kind of motivation, we should participate in this Lamrim discourse, discourse on the stage of the path leading to enlightenment by Manjushri Lama Tsongkhapa.
Tenzi jondo ba me be da ba me ba de le mai ba ye do xiao de ne so ye je ne da le jo be de je de na ne bo ba che no che be jo la zo na na do le di de ne xiao xiao len je jo de ne che je de na de men ro lu dong la te ya che da le nya wa na ma de chigo kan dang tu na de zhe xue jin me zhe xi zhe xi me zhe ba lu xi me zhe lu dong be be xi gu de cing zhen song be ga de da jie go be xi gu yi me zhe ji zhe ni ngo bo na la ba dong da wa yi wa de be ngo bo ma ta yin de de ra ge yi zhe ra yi wa de Rajiva Jakayata Omaran Jibalang, Yama, she said me. Then the Tizo Joy, Ranshi, Mayaba, Mojo, Tijo, Koshila, Ranshi, Yama. Shabani Gopama, Ranjiva, Nikalako, Suji, she said, Shabavati, Julu, attends me, she was to say me. Togola. 대양마 주와 대다기 마저나 도저비 고서되면서 마저 거라서 도미 마저와 마저한테 대다기 로라 가는 마저 송사디랑 위해서 이러고 나 이놈 왔다 여봐 여봐 때서 대다 나시고 나왔으면 진짜 시고 최진 제가 참았던 양하고 이제 하고 나면 제가 가라라고 해서 이제 뭐 다이다 아니 뒤뒤지 참아매 배시고 저런요데 올라오는데 고네 라디오 와봐 이나 와대야 바로 와라고 나와라 이제 매봐도 대야 버려버려 이제 매봐도 비베다와 살디베 제베라 저런 이거 와라 위에 소리 셔 인. 어머 되죠아 나베제 제 신예베 또 그저도 베제바 제베제라 저런 이거 비고 제 세바네 이게 샤고 디 송다 자네시 나랑게 가게베제 예바니 랑바 예도 랑바 니도 시베 동지 주치니 대체제 메가로서 대권은 냠바죠와 되어버리는데 이제 랑바 이노 최대 제다와 냠마나 리시 리게 레베 시조다 저다 뭐지바데 맥시바서 비베타 예레바자지 주가 돈을 깨롱마 깨롱로는 돈다바 저가봐 최제들의 주제 최소 때마디 뒤에서데 되고나도 뒤에만 기회서 오늘 들어가길래 뭐 뒤지 이주는 되고나도 좀 되고나 이제 동양 많이 소소하더니 뭐 뒤에 시비에 이제 돈이 뭐로 유진 좀 반지 왜 타니 시비에 대사지 말해벨레 비베트바에 노데는 마주에 예베 돈 주실라면 나라가 주실라 나메 돈 Madu Shiva Mande, Chinchelo, to get the Shimala. Madu Shiva Rang, you pen to Bombay, go and you'll enjoy Tata, Tane, Tata, she has some betono, Tinisha, Kongi, say Shivan. Yavan, Miba, Kalaye, Jebe, Patelo, Chilo, Javan, Mila was a bit. Shiva Tanya, Barbari, Taki, you didn't, but Shivan. Sudala Rango. To be Ranchi Mage and do Omishive, you were soon the Domiji Shive soon. No other Shago, I'm saying you, Susan, no, what he is serious and you were Jewy. Tochata, Meba, Kalaja, Shiva, the Ranse, Mage, do not Shiva, Ranse, Totama turned to Kalaja Shabby, Tono, Gadesha was it. Tanganzo Tikarsa. Left side of the kid is choosing to know this is that choosing to know the Bakan. That the Gobble little go by you say at in my said, do what he get low bone, you don't go so last of your tongue. Gaji Mingani. Drivon, though I say, the magic home like Lenga Michi song so. What is thank you, Lola? See that Samada in the bed. Tak namsha me Marioris, Ronze Tribeti Yomaris, the Chusian that to the Yomars, Otilo Gomparis, what in the season.
So Geshe read from page 260 of volume number 3 in the English translation of Lamrim Chemo to page 262. And so back to page 260 where we left off a couple of weeks ago. And an important issue, the point that we talked about at the time was whether there is what we called a common subject, a subject that is acceptable from a common perspective, between the two schools of thought, and so we have seen argumentations that a common ground cannot be found between essentialist and the non-essentialist. If you don't find a common ground or a subject, then really the rest of the argument that is framed in the syllogistic format, right? Because we have a subject, predicate, and reason, nothing would work out because right from the beginning, the subject is not established, so you can't really talk about the predicate and the reason, right? So those are the things we already talked about quite a bit. And so, of course, because we are talking about the distinction between Sevatandika Madhyamikas and Prasangika Madhyamikans, and Baba Viveka and the school of thought also claim that their interpretation is the correct interpretation of what Arya Nagarjuna has stated in his works, right? And the Chandrakirti comes on, well, your interpretation is not quite right there, and let me tell you why, where you got it wrong, so to speak. And so in the Prasangika Madhyamika schools of thought, they do accept pramana or valid cognition, sema. Okay? They do accept what we call perfect syllogistic reasoning, or tagyanta in Tibetan. What they don't accept, which is not acceptable to them, where we say there's no common ground, is they do not accept what is called autonomous syllogistic reasoning or rangyujita, right? I think, right? Because that assumes that things exist intrinsically. For Prasangika Madhyamikans, nothing exists intrinsically. So therefore, essentialists and the non-essentialists, they really don't have a common ground, where they can have a kind of a conversation or debate, with each other. So that's where we kind of left off. Last time.
Congress Teta Chinjalo, Chinjamo Tati, Chinjamo, Nega, Chinjalo, Yoma. Conju Chuji need to show Milkons of Hala, teacher, Shima Soy Jonda, Shima Jobe, Denzi Jon Doba Mebe. Doba Mebe, then the Lema no Shema was started the Lingding is an Karsa. Damita do the Shijetina, the Tina Miso goes with Shachos, Shijet Shachos, that's what the Shacho Maris, Karsana, Chinjilo, Chinjimo Tati, what is it? Any Miso. Melas make Shivalas over soul Madu at the Triva in Yawara Kajeta, Tusheda, Chinjilo, that Triva Zamka and do them. You talk about trees, I did my Chinjilo, the Chinjimolo City, Lohida, Tamanita, Tativa, Resiva. So the Queen Yingaki Triva Shija Yomari Yometa, Tada lineage Mekunza was Jeta Tonta, but any Gunzo, you will come and tell much Misotum Shacho is and Oti Dumaris, Tidim, so Yomaris.
Just to kind of refresh our mind again, according to Baba Viveka, Lobon Langdon said, he thought there could be, as a part of his argumentation, a common subject, Chujen Tunamba, or a subject from common perspectives between him and the Chantakidis and the Prasangika Madhyamikans. And his example was, just as we have a common ground when we say sound is impermanent because it's a product, right? So the sound is a common subject, right? We could have a debate about it, So in the same way, when we bring, say, like any other subject, we call the visual sources of the consciousness, and so on. So that should be a common ground for us. Okay? And Chandrakirti tells, well, your example doesn't work here, because, in the case of the sound, there is such things as generic sound, right? Unqualified sound. You don't have to qualify it as being this and that. Just if a sound is produced and you can say, did you hear that? Is that a sound, right? Then there's a common ground for that. But when the Baba Vivekas, bring other subjects like what we call the sensory sources of the consciousness, the assumption here is that they exist intrinsically, and that becomes problematic for the Prasangika Madhyamikans because nothing exists intrinsically, and so therefore there is no common ground here. That's what the Chandrakirti is pointing out. The reason for that is if we do assert a common ground, just the way Baba Viveka is kind of trying to make his case, then we have to, assume that there is we could also find a common example of a distorted perception, Lokshe, and a valid cognition, Tsema, which is impossible, right? Distorted perception or the wrong perception, Lokshe, and the valid cognition, they really couldn't agree with each other. There cannot be something that is both, So if we go with the Baba Viveka's kind of proposition, then that's the kind of, bizarre, weird, the place we end up with, where we say, yeah, there is a common example between distorted perception and valid cognition, which is just impossible. Yeah, so these are the things that Chandrakirti brings back to Baba Viveka's.
Karsa sugi jeje shechira dal kya mede en yeve chersin dinen se pomba shins ta sugi jeje sena jidani ta changjen sen de ngombar sewa de mase ni yorwa ti rondo cheje su yeve cherse che ta pedele dinen se pomba chisi de ngombar sesin derwa ngombar sesin de rongje changjen yo dal kya de marwa sheda ti de tumbe de ngombar sesin pomba chisi warwa Chebe Joala son any son to leves, what did you look the Lord in Hever shows? What is he here that is over that the Lenga Hanesus in addition word. 6 years of here, what is Hever show, Lengi showed the doggy. She did to the middle don't day, Shirayan and the Shiko 당 투는 좀be look던 be 시고디는 식셀 송be 갑데 대다 갑데 내 다겨고be 치고 이메장 제 능고가 나라 동하다 바라 시요데비 ngobo 타니 되다라 랑 생이 되버나 시여반데비 랑주바 이가 이노스 어디 단데 코나지단 제바 값스 어디 다겨고be 값숑르지나 다겨고나 가리가는 마다데 간제 가다 이제 ene raze chobati ganga chibwa me yinza ni kawaye na ja chogure siwa shwa dagye jiwo jago maris
No, sir.
go dizare ime ye jirgo bana to da ba yi ba debe go mo tanyi de da rang ji ji yi ba debe rang ji ba ni ga yin no station da oma rang ji ba ya ngo ni ma se ji dang ngo ni ma se na oma be meng na ra de xiao ro wa
No, sir.
ina de da de ngo ni ma se de rang ji xiao ma se in te yo xiao de se yo wa rang ji yo ma xiao ne ngo ma tang rong ju ba yi ka la ko xiao sa da ngo ma se na sim zhe men ji de wa
No, no.
da ngo rong ju ba da ten ju wa le ngo ni ma ba xie sim zhe men ji de ngo ma se go ji dang de re wa ina da da de ka ba de ene ka sa ngo ni ma se rong ju xiao ma le ene ten ju xiao go de se yin se
No, sir. So as a part of the debated argumentation, Baba Viveka, how should I say, advances this syllogistic, reasoning where Sugi Keje Chöjin, right, the what called visible forms, for example, they are not produced from themselves. That means there is no self-production, okay? Because the reason is they exist, and just like a vase or a pot, pumbashin, okay? And so again, Chandrakirti takes issue with that. He said, again, you think that the visible form you said could be common ground among many schools of thought, but not necessarily. When we think in terms of the Tangchenpa, the enumerators, they make a distinction between sort of a visible form and then kind of an invisible dormant form, isn't it? So only when form becomes visible, then they accept that as being produced. But when the form is invisible, sort of in a dormant form, it's not considered as a product. Okay? So again, the subject that you think is a common among many schools of thought is not necessarily. And then you look at the example. The example you brought is a vase. Well, vase is a visible form. Whereas your subject could include both visible and invisible objects. And so therefore it becomes problematic. If something is visible, for the enumerators, there's no need to be produced it again. It's already produced. It's there, so to speak, in your face kind of thing. But they didn't use that expression, And so again, Chandrakirti takes the issue that your syllogistic reasoning is problematic, here, and it's not acceptable necessarily to different schools of thought. So all of those things are much, I think, more kind of dealt with in a clear words treatise, Siksal, by the Chandrakirti. And so usually when we use the word Nguemawa, I think which has been translated as essentialist, we use it to refer to certain schools of thought from Chittamatrin's mind-only school and schools below, isn't it? When we say middle way school, that includes Sevatandika, Madhyamigans, and Prasangika Madhyamigans. Okay. But then again, when we use another terminology, Ngoni Meparmawa, the proponents of a non-intrinsic reality or the reality, but that particular terminology, it really refers to the Prasangika Madhyamigans and not the Sevatandika Madhyamigans. So there are all those subtle distinctions that we need to kind of keep track of,
No, the solution is here. Musu sama toko. They are madriver. They dagi madro no. Thondre musu mero madriver goes. This is what that and that. then the Sugi Geshe Zu the Zan and then Geshe the Miki Shower, Onji Shower, says the Lingden Jig and the Onji Tondi to Ganga Madu Shower, the only trainer and the college when Sunzi Miki so treason the go soaked over Joto Marwa. I think in the Onji is an only non Togo, then Madonna and the Conzo in the Mevare race. Because the Domi Madu and Tada low glass, Kala Madu, Sonsa tea, Rang Sing Juba, Sing Juba Tena, not the Yuba and Yuba. That's the Rang Sing Juba now and Nashi, couldn't Yuba killing words. Say Rang you told war. Then the Chico that Sama Chida, he Chuja Semani. No go to Mirunde, sure can I run sing to go tie the maybe, Tidruji, semi baby, sure, yam deuce, low on the gone, run you go by you know, and daughter will shed that daughter will lose in the end of the Suzuki Muslim Madu at the Yomaris. In Timmy that today similar to Yama Timmy, she is to know Yomaris. Or tell a gone any children to whom to Laris. You don't go from Bata to Yoma till Omar.
So Baba Viveka, in his kind of that syllogistic reasoning example, where he has said visible form is not produced from itself because it exists. And so what can really establish the existence of a visible form? It has to be what are called visual sensory perception, isn't it? A visual sensory perception, or in other words, just to be simple, eyes see a form, all right? And then we can say, okay, that form exists, but I see it, okay? But in that kind of assumption, according to Baba Viveka, that visual perception is valid with regard to the form, visible form. Valid in what sense, he would say? It's valid in the sense that the visible form appears to it as intrinsically existent, and that's the way it really exists. And so that visual perception is a valid perception, you know. It sees the form to exist intrinsically, and that's how the form really exists, according to Baba Viveka. So therefore, it is a valid cognition, isn't it? And Chandrakirti says, well, there is a problem, you know, because for us, you know, that cannot be a valid cognition because a visible form appears to it as intrinsically existent. It does not exist intrinsically, you know. So therefore, you and I don't have a common ground here, like a common subject to debate about. You know, this is what Chandrakirti kind of tells the Baba Viveka and followers his school of thought. The idea is for Prasangika Madhyamikans, every, how should I say, direct perceptions of ordinary sentient beings are necessarily fallible or mistaken, isn't it? There is no, unmistaken, ordinary, direct perception. Whereas Baba Viveka says there is one, right? So some says yes, the other says no. So you don't have a common ground here, is it? That's the part of the argumentations that we are dealing with. By saying that and refuting, the common ground between, the Baba Viveka school of thought and the Prasangika, of course, Prasangikas are not crazy to say, therefore, we say that, nothing exists at all. The vases don't exist, the flowers don't exist. Well, he didn't use the word example. I like flowers, I throw that one in there, okay? Well, yes, there are flowers, that we can all experience and see. There are vases, that's not the point. The point is, there are no intrinsically existent vases, which you insist there is, and we say, hello, no, so there is no common ground to talk there. Of course, flowers exist, vases exist, that's not the issue over here,
Ranju Goba Gobi Tsuichewa Ingi Oma Tenjo na Prinzi Chinibe Tonga Hila Tobi Jeva Yela de Ranju Gumuke Cheva Nishi Shaus that other in a Karsa. She don't pick Pumbachi in a Karsa. Demi in the Tendi Beaches La, in a Tila de Tan, in a Pumbati, in it. 통탄바레 군도리 디데제와 마시시는 투야요리 디온시는 제바시 단다데 가르사 링데제 따부디 그런 켈랑 티니 그런 데바 나이시는 쇼지 두무도 슬라고 오르미지 디데 켈랑 티 마디오시는 지당베 데미도야 돈다지고 있나 에네 디 최제 마도 좀 유마레시 tendiyo nambendiyo tendiyo mena shendale jirwa no sheda de goma tada di korasan in konzo te tawa do ya thonda in konzo deba de tse ton yo mar se dibje go ri me de cheta ta ko gangal ya sheje te no kharsa khanji rang ji chba ta mo chba khaya ma jo thwa yore su wara.
So in a general sense, it is possible to find a common subject or a ground, right, between different schools of thought. They may have a different standpoint on certain aspects of whatever it is, but they could still have a common subject to talk about. Let's say, in a general sense, we may be able to propound a syllogistic reasoning such as this. A vase or a pot, pumba, for instance, chujin, does not exist truly, is not truly existent, because it's dependent arising. It's possible among different schools of thought there is such thing as a vase, kind of unqualified vase or a pot. Okay? So Prasangikas are not saying that such a vase does not exist at all. The issue here is the Baba Viveka is very much kind of a, how to say, maybe stuck in his own kind of mindset, philosophy, which he insists that if something exists, it must exist intrinsically, because that is his fundamental assumption, isn't it? So when you kind of pack that into your own terminology, then it's just like you're imposing your idea on others, which is unacceptable, isn't it? Every time Baba Viveka says something like, okay, this for instance, X or Z for instance, while X and Y is taken for granted as intrinsically existent, right? So it's already qualified, because that's your fundamental assumption, and the Prasangikas have a real issue with that, because for them, it's just the opposite. Nothing exists intrinsically. Yeah? That's why Chandrakirti says, I'm just telling you, it's just between you and us, there is no common ground. I'm not saying there's no common ground or not possible at all among different schools of thought. Okay? It is possible. In general, there is a vase, right?
대야 쇼는 현재 강세셔니 켈랑바 니도 켈랑바 니도 시베 돈 줍제셔 대셔 소로서바네 때가 맞아베 냠바 줘왔대 링년디 라니 켈랑바인도 시진 제 진짜 타니 레비 친조로서 인고분이 봤대 내가 시월로서 타니베 시월도 이르베 돈노스 데다가지 링년게 네 데르스 워다 그런스는 이제 지금 켈랑티운데 tenjo pashi da ene thonta ba chodu gur siru ma linde khona log no bishine mizo gondo ti yose ma thonta ba chodu simu arwa bo cheta linde khona chita khelen jina ene mizo gondo ti yose ma thonta ba yob simu dos yena khona sheunde da ene maju shi be ni dong shi la wi de zan thonta ba de do dos cheta dan ge wa sha de sha ko de se wa ta sikse ka de ka dire ka ye sa
So Chandrakirti, in his clear words or siksal, clarifies that Baba Viveka, for them, let's say visual form or any other phenomena you take, they say, they exist conventionally, okay? But in that assumption, conventionally, what is kind of mixed together with that is the notion of intrinsic reality, isn't it? So even if they think they are talking at the conventional level, right, when you say forms exist, but from Prasangika's point of view, the assumption that you have made that exists conventionally is also intrinsically at the same time, so that brings the debate at the ultimate level, isn't it? Okay? Because according to them, forms exist, and there are what called valid sensory perceptions, right, that establish the form, sees. And they are valid in what sense? Because forms appear to them as intrinsically existent, and this is how they exist. So that part of the argumentation really, it raises the argument at the level of the ultimate. It's not just at the conventional level. Okay? So therefore, Pasangika say, even though you think like you are talking at the conventional level, that very assumption and the reason you bring forth, because the form exists because it is established by sensory valid perception, that's unmistaken to it, that raises the issue because there is no such thing as intrinsic reality. Okay? And so that's the debate between them.
그래서 매일 기와서 이외 자기 저도 계란 내 돈도 뭐 기와 갖고 네 최신 대달들 르제추 스템바테 템바티 티체 티 체르 데코나 좀나 나 데테마게 셔도나 대달 계란 유진 지케 레모 진접제네 데코냐 뭐저시 데코야 동에 많이 소소버다네 마주에 히베니베 돈도 모르게 유진 좀베제베 타니베 히베니와 임비 대다장 마릭빌레비 추바이노 되는 마주에 니바 왜돈 추시려면은 추시는 나에 돈 마주에 면한테 신질로 추시다 신질로 뭐 메주히베니 랑랑이 유변진 스방디고 방베고네 유런 주비 타니 주비 타데와 임비셔로 다 건줄 더다르데 팀이다 가르스 신질로 지 뭐디 men저버 유전 가르스는 에네 다고드잖아 에네 다데 에네 다 추진을 된 거래 추진 된 거로 왔다 러시 줘서는 에네 추진 된 거 말이지 그 수도 저거로 러시 때문에 저거 쓰고로 추진 된 거 말이지 됐어 그래 다데 안에 지제되는 거 가르스 데코나 데뭐 통간이 소소서 왔다 마주시베 니베도 문우에스 다티 코르땡고에나 저는 마주시베 니바 있어야 돼 얘도 우스로와 다 마주시베 니바 있는데 티코나니도 조우스 저는 견디들에서다 켈란데다 마주시베 니바이 티코나니도 마주스 켈레서다 코니 데브지를 와요 말봐 어디서때 저 레카데 자나와게나 이 세제 마주 용봉 도움도 쓰고
So Chandrakirti tells Baba Viveka that even though you insist that your example is a common example of a subject, but it really is not. And the issue is that you assume, that's your fundamental assumption, that things exist intrinsically, right? Intrinsically means independently in and of itself. It's not dependent on anything else at all. Right? That's your fundamental assumption. Yeah? And if that's the case, then when you kind of provide a syllogistic reasoning where you have a subject, predicate, and a reason, right? And these are interconnected and related. The reason is dependent upon the predicate, right? The predicate is dependent upon the subject. You cannot accept that kind of interdependency because your whole assumption is intrinsic existence, right? Independent, autonomous completely. And so you are telling me that a visible form exists intrinsically because that is established as such by the what called visual sensory perception, to which it appears as intrinsically existent, and it does exist that way. That's your fundamental assumption. But at the same time, you are saying that there is some kind of a dependent relationship among things. That's contradictory of itself, right? If you say something exists independently and autonomously and intrinsically, you really cannot talk about interdependent connection relationship with each other. But if you say there is interdependent connection between reason, predicates, and subject, well, then you better let go the intrinsic part of it, which you don't. So there is what we call contradictions, just within your own assumptions. So therefore, there is no common ground, for us to debate about.
그래서 해반의 친절로도 친절 못하대바이 다는 해반의 타대바이 예도 해수부터 뒤 해반이 강세 해반님 미바 갈아 예제베 바로 될 친절로 제반이 메로서베 해바 타니베 마르빌레와 남소스 마르빌레와 다 가지 텐주로 시는 데려와 가서 다 소소지오 가서 시바 피질 데레 취시 미쳐거라
No.
지위자도 거 랑제 랑제 두는 거라
No.
뒤도 취이래 로라
No.
줘야 민두스 대다 요마니도 인제바시는 소자라서 바라고니지 최외 책이 미해현도 엄부시바 여바 송아지 또미 시베 송아는 노아자의 샤고베 랑생 니도 수소노 시다 더 온실에는 제아데 온실이 demban 진세아디 미세라고 말와 demban 나와다가 주의에 시작했어 demban 중 말라고 어디서 왔다 이와송아데 또미시베 수에 나와자 노소 나와자를 차고에 그 주의해야 돼 그래서 내려 나와다가 뭐지 그 딘좀 지금 말했어 어디래서 어째 나와자 주는다 디동자 저저와 디제 예벌기와 뭐 동차자비양 메바카라 주스 세다 코트리에 이제 그 데버서 나자다 쿠스와다 다 주야 요마라 와스 그 나요 주르와 어디면 시와네 테다 랑제 미에게 나에시네 시바다게 랑이 진이와 처모에 좀 가다 jir시베 동노스가 책셀 되는 좋아자위다와 간직하다야 언이티 제가 데데 나다스 언이 나세 언이 데만 지기도 말 데만 난 거리 데만 나왔다 네 지선은 라시 좀좀그레스 디즈도 저런 시진의 주야 차담지요 말이스 요 말와 어디다 언이 나왔다 주는 데만 두고 거와 어디요 말이 저런 어디 저 두면 두스 어디 있어
What really, alternatively speaking, when we say there's a contradiction in your own like a position, Baba Viveka's, it means that you might, almost end up accepting there is something that is both distorted perception, Chinjilo, and undistorted or valid perception, which is just impossible. Because if something is valid, then it cannot be distorted, right? If something is distorted, then it cannot be valid. Understand? The issue here, as we say, is that sensory objects, including visible forms, they appear to their respective sensory perceptions as intrinsically existent, right? They appear, but the sensory perceptions cannot perceive them to be intrinsically existent. Are you with me so far? They simply appear to the sensory perceptions as intrinsically existent. Sensory perceptions do not see them as intrinsically existent. Okay, my second footnote, just like the conceptual perceptions, right? And so when you say that the valid perceptions, right, establish them as intrinsically existent, that's impossible because the sensory perceptions cannot see something existing intrinsically. Simply things appear to them as being intrinsically existent. Okay? And but in your fundamental assumption, things appear, forms, sounds appear to their sensory perceptions as intrinsically existent, and then you conclude that is how they exist, even though the sensory perceptions themselves do not see them, cannot see them as intrinsically existent. Yeah. Pasangiga Madhyamikan's argument is that, yes, we agree that things appear to sensory perceptions as intrinsically existent, just like you, but they really don't exist in that way. Okay? They couldn't exist in that way. The reason why things appear to our sensory perceptions intrinsically existent, autonomously, is because our perceptions are influenced by avidya, ignorance. God blessed by the ignorance. So that's how things appear to us as intrinsically existent, even though they don't, right? That's what the Prasangya Madhyamikans are explaining to Baba Viveka. So all of these things are much more dealt with in the clear words, commentary.
onshidi and ko ranze chiba nangu yorsa nang ranze chiba nang nale and yeve yeva yomaris but tashi zaya to yoma tashi zaya na yorwas odina yi the trishi res sheda the maju shibe ni suksa so minzi do se de minzi do shibe to ba ne se da maju shiba se da da de de yosere to yin osu do be shiba shagusere wa to yin osu de be shiba en de ba chiba na da de khaya 요만 집에 니가 요마라 뭐 되게 미카르사 가 민지노 셰다마 거기서 러럽제 많이 발 해서 소스 제 러럽제 많이 발 에네 타히 자와나 요마 타히 지바 요마 카가 요마라 러럽제 되는 거로 어지 뭐시 카르사 많이 발 해서 소 디지 진짜 몰라봐는 뭐주 이셔봐 디 디코는 무슨도 제바 바이올라 제발라 예게 해나 메도 스테 마주에들 티고니 돈이 무슨 또 시와 뭐 이지리 해 시와 가고 트리시 비샤지 거와 어 데르 티요라 티야 양도 봐 뭐에 봐 드면도 봐 티코는 돈이 메르베 소자소 드면도 버터 예원제 봐오 페나 라르다 제베스 미히 예타히 예타히 자베 나와 마미 바타로스 저다 러르 밍게 되게 아니 자긴 잡아 나한테 파시네 자긴 그 현달 잡아야 나가 말아 뭐 디어 말이지 어디서 그래
So Prasangikas are telling Baba Viveka that things may appear to our perceptions in one way, but that does not necessarily have to be true in a case. Yeah? Just like people who have some visual problem, they might start to see some illusory, falling of the hair pieces, But people who have good eyesight, they don't see that, But when somebody who has that eye problem, vision problem, they started to have this kind of imaginary hair falling down, right? And then they think that is true. But it simply appears to them and their visual perception is a distorted one, And we don't go with the distorted perception, we go with the correct perception. So in the same way, according to Prasangika Madhyamikans, all of our perceptions, our means with ordinary sentient beings, are necessarily mistaken perceptions. Okay? Right? That's a big difference, isn't it? Whereas Baba Viveka claims that there are valid perceptions, right, in us, but according to Prasangika Madhyamikans, the reason why our ordinary perceptions are mistaken is things appear to us as truly existent, intrinsically existent, ultimately existent, but they don't exist that way. So we are mistaken, blessed by the ignorance, So the only unmistaken perception, in the sense, is a sort of category, right? For Prasangika Madhyamikans is the non-conceptual direct perception of emptiness as it is. Right? So if you have non-conceptual direct perception of emptiness as it is, that's the only one that's a valid, unmistaken perception, because things don't appear to them as intrinsically existent, and they don't perceive, it doesn't perceive them as intrinsically existent. Apart from that perception, all other ordinary perceptions we have are mistaken perception.
다 예바만 유랑시 마초보 텐저 마주시베 이 유진디 찾아야 문제데 대달디 마즈베 셰로 시베 돈스 다 식세가 되잖아요. 예바만 요새 랑시 예바만 봐. 계세 에네 나와다를 숙소도 나와다 저기는 시도스럽 되는 에네 단자 돈용으로도 로 세고 그러 어디 돈용으로도 로 되게 에네 대바트바 라이트바 샤좀 세고 통요 말이지. 그래서 다그 마동인데 다그 라이트바 그 통거라. 어디 에네 요 말이지.
So in the clear words, we come across expressions such as yoba mayimba, something not existent. What it really means is something that does not exist intrinsically. Yeah, that's not intrinsically existent. And why Prasangika Madhyamikans say that there is nothing that exists intrinsically, because the only valid unmistaken perception is the non-conceptual direct perception of emptiness as it is. if something were to exist intrinsically, then this non-conceptual perception should see it, whereas this non-conceptual perception of emptiness does not see anything as existing intrinsically. So therefore, the conclusion is nothing exists intrinsically.
대다 고물루도 쇼그 시지 거와니 제대 해소된 디 무슨라서베 체마히 랑신이 주베 주베세 인 동가양 마저바 소바세 내리 공수 잡아 이노스 다 tengyoloska pekinje semasila namgi ngusum jewasi pekinje semashan semashi shawora o this is it ro se semashi shawdi semashi odi in the wrong thing to say tumgeje yo maris the wolu to komshin ro ko se teta shizo nga she ton diwa yin la se da maju yide de to do shina in the two maju any pege ngongge she in the tige in shojin to mu se ati imeda 거기 최신이 되죠. 미국도 가라요 제바네스. 거기 다 책세 거기 최신이 미국도 가라요 세야 돼. 디스워다. 지도 미국도 메르스고 말와. 디레 다 링데지 다 디레 제베 카디갈 이네 동동 제와 마시와 군도 제와 마시 거기 제와 마시 최신 미 샤요 말이지. 요 어디 샤요 말이. 제도 링데지 선데 샤야스. 다 키진데 가르사 any shirba damata duya dirmo hezaimba ati kunzoda tonugaso chebashida dago mare shirwa tonugo shiriyo mare kunzago shiriyo so laro o yosa tende mebato to te chuje tino mesega remado jedan 매일 소바테 군좀 쉬어 많이 쉬고 말이죠. 와 맥군좀 가라 유스라로. 다 직세 코르세시도 맥군좀 가라 유디. 맥군좀 요 말이 왜 맥이는 군좀 비치고 말을 해야 돼. 리기나. 어디 맥군좀 가라 유스야 되디. 됐다 보니 켈란 티베체 이니 케버 그야 뭐 맥군좀 동야 요 말을 해 뭐. 지도 맥군좀 요로. 맥이는 군좀 비차로. 어디 있어 근데.
al mix na de wang she mi sung go wa
la
mi di sung go be
re meg da meg kunzo se da meg se da meg hiba shana de meg ong bo shana che di shira yo mare
So in general, Prasangika mathematikers do accept a number of different types of valid cognitions. They talk about actually 4 types of valid cognitions, like samashi, which would include a valid cognition pertaining to exemplary case, but all of these valid cognitions Prasangikas accept does not exist in and of itself intrinsically. Okay, so there's no such thing as intrinsic valid cognitions. Okay, for Prasangikas, so even though the Baba Viveka insists that still is a common ground or common subject possibly could between him and the Chandrakirtis and other schools of thought. The Chandrakirtis say that is just impossible because of your fundamental basic assumption. Even though you think you are talking at the conventional level, you said eyes exist, whatever, any other perceptions, but your fundamental assumption is this exists intrinsically, which takes it to the level of ultimate analysis, isn't it? Okay, so we already talked about, those 2 levels of analysis are very different. Conventional analysis and ultimate analysis are very different kind of analysis, isn't it? At the conventional analysis, we could usually find many common possibilities and common grounds. But at the ultimate analysis, it's rather very hard to find a common ground, right? And especially, there is no common ground between the Baba Viveka's school of thought and the Chandrakirtis and other Prasangika school of thought, because one believes in intrinsic reality, other says that doesn't exist at all, So where is a common, right? They antithetically contradict each other, right? They're just against directly, so they cannot be common ground, right? So therefore, let's say, from Prasangika's point of view, whatever Baba Viveka say, that even could not exist conventionally, right? Because the assumption is, even things exist intrinsically conventionally, and for Prasangika, nothing exists intrinsically. right? So what is considered as conventional existence by the Baba Viveka, that is no to the Prasangikas, isn't it? So by saying that, Prasangikas are not saying that things don't exist conventionally. Things do exist conventionally, but not the way you said it exists conventionally. Are you with me? I know there's a lot of things to wrap our head around. Yeah.
Teaching his wrong mood, he no ma, so he gets in the shabby. Madu wasn't the Madu. Nikela, Tinan the Tribi, Shujin Juji, Sama Meba, Rangi Dai, Chicola, and a driver shy, short Jomi shouted me, Jeb, Tono, that 6 8 in T. said, Dilman, Jeshi Joe, the consequence of my day, and the channels of it, and the Madu Shiva, Muzoguns of Chago, she said, Madu Shiva Yoma, the in a choosing model, John Ranza Negris.
No, so.
A shed that you know the dying that they told me to see John Juris.
No, so. We are on page 262, and so fundamentally, Baba Viveka's and schools of thought accept that something has to be findable, right, under analysis. Even when they say something exists conventionally, it has to be findable under analysis. And findable in what sense is something that exists there, from its own side. It's almost like, hello, I'm here, It has to be found, okay? And so then they said there are valid cognitions, right? Because things appear to exist that way, and that's how the things exist. That's their fundamental assumption, isn't it? Okay. And from Prasangika's point of view, well, that's a distorted perception, isn't it? Things appear to exist intrinsically, but they really don't exist that way. So there is no common ground. So when, based upon that fundamental assumption, when the Baba Viveka advanced his syllogistic reasoning, then the Prasangika say, your reason is not working, because the reason has to be dependent upon the predicate is dependent upon the subject, they're interrelated, whereas your assumption is that nothing depends on anything else at all. So your reason is invalid,
Okay, the time the runs and the good Ranjim short time, Koja and Titan Mende, Ranju and Shayan, so you short Jomi, you do, she, Yana said that, according to the language, that 10 years shorter than the initiation of the Majority short John River, and the Ranju killing on the Shina, initiation of Shash over Ducha do show is, Lavina Sigura. Tanya did a Ranju what Medabaning among the Shaging Taduyan, Shaves, land in the river minors, that in the Ranzin Trabam Rigmaris, in the Ranzin motor is taking in Mavushi, the article with the Ranzin to water here. She did that for a few years that you have Korajani, to Lanti lands rate of one.
So if Baba Viveka were to insist, and tell the Chandakirti Prasangikas, what? If you don't believe in the common ground, that's your problem, But we don't have a problem. Because for us, things exist intrinsically, and that's just working fine with us. So the Chandakirti can only say, what? All this time, what have we been debating about? Right? You claim there is intrinsic reality, and we say there is no intrinsic reality. We have been through this, in many ways, Now, I don't think anything adding more is going to, be solvency for the problem, right? Nothing is resolved going to it, because you just simply insist, right? Your way is the right way, and things exist intrinsically. And we say that's not true, cannot be, and we're just going to go loopy-loop, right? In the circle, right? We go merry-go-round circle, and nothing going to resolve here,
Oh, that is done. Niba peko at Minda, the Hina, Tixele, Pell and Doyo Mino, Tena Dry Chet, the Medavici, Shavajo, no Mendova, Nikala, young Yena. Tishan, make it Tombany, Mayba, Mata, Kunzo, the K. Malala. Tontaban, young Maybe, Pet, Bell and Doyo Mino, Shiva was there, Dakonje, Kunzo dependent. Rashi Meta Shivishes Lavina. In the Nangayan did Junju Dasi Kai Tia Goma, the Drakon Amjo Kodia Sindi or the Tandadi Tondum Chicken to the did a chair Majiwag any Madrid and Yidom mind, Tree Yidom mind, did it? It's a Karsa, Niga Yidom, but she is no your Marisheta. Children Petty, the Tegamundus,
No, so
Pedon Sungum to Zura.
no. No. So kind of revisiting the syllogistic reasoning example that Baba Viveka provided, which is sound is the subject, is impermanent, predicate, because it is a product, it is produced. Okay? So in this particular case, sound is a common subject. Okay? We don't have to qualify it by anything else at all, because in generic sense, there is a sound, right? Or in some schools of thought, as we already talked about, sound is permanent because it is an element of a space. Okay? We don't qualify it as being that. Or for some other schools, sound is an elemental product, jungjur, right? Well, we don't qualify with that. We say sound in general. Isn't there something called sound? You know, you can hear, I can hear, we can agree, right? There is a generic sound. So in that example, it's fine because we find a common sound acceptable to different schools of thought, and then we can say whether it's permanent or impermanent, right? We can debate about it. But that example is not working with your main argumentation, which you say is visible form, right, is not self-produced because it exists, just like a vase, you know. Because the visible form that you say is a common subject is not a common subject, because for you, it exists and it must exist intrinsically, and for us, it should not, and it cannot, and it will not exist intrinsically. So we don't have a common, common ground here. Whether you qualify it as or not, that's your fundamental assumption. When you say something exists, you really mean it exists out there intrinsically, and that's not acceptable to us, right? Prasangika Madhyamikans. So we have no common ground here. And for you, intrinsically existent form is perceived by a valid cognition, right? For us, that is a distorted perception. For you, it is a valid perception. So we cannot have something that's both valid and invalid at the same time, right? So there is no, again, something that's agreed, agreeable between two of us,
Because you can maybe the data you'll do me to Kayam maybe metabolism is yola. Then you can maybe middle so major domain. Study Chevatel this or that. Sita in the dry and Nange Yondi, and Junju dry in Ringa Ingo ready. Die they got that. And Tini Karungo Madi, Mizo in a Yaman Tonta Togo, Gunzo, Yaman Gunzo Togs. Today Chevagia is the Mare Silora. But the die Junju die in the Junju Dabia, Nanga and they die Yomar, move some of Dandra. In the churches with Nanga and the in Junju Kan Salamato, Amjo fissions on the dig to Warwa. But or this were Chitan Dalia and Junju, the Nanga and the Karuma. Chitama Jayar Sone, the Yomaris, the Yoris, that Mixo Yomaris Lane, in Chokyo Shadow, the Dilla.
So in the case of sound as an example, in some schools of thought, it is the elemental product, which is necessarily impermanent. For in other schools of thought, it is the element of a space, which is a permanent, isn't it? But they can still say, you make a sound and you say, did you hear? Do we agree that's a sound now? So we don't have to qualify it either as this or that, isn't it? Yeah? And it has to be one of the two, actually. Either it is elemental product or it is an element of a space, whatever. But we don't have to get into that debate. We can just say in a conventional sense, what did you hear? Is that a sound or what do you call that? Right? We can really have a common ground. But in the case of the visible form that Baba Vivek gives example, it has to be one of these two things. Either it should exist intrinsically or it shouldn't exist intrinsically, isn't it? There is no any other third option here, kind of or not kind of. There isn't. Either or really clear cut, right? So Baba Viveka insists that it exists intrinsically, right? And Prasangika say that's not possible at all. And when Prasangika say that doesn't exist intrinsically, and the Baba Viveka say no, it does exist. So there is no, right? How should I say, middle ground here.
오늘 거인냐는 중규를 해봐. 중규 자시와 나가야데 쉐베 쳐봐 가능 쳐봐디 맞아봐. 자여봐 예베 고니보 대달라 로라 자여라. 랑시 도마다 랑시 무도 마니 로라 추베시베 추바야 마이 그래서 머주 시베 추바야 마이 추베시베 추바야 마이베 세메 추베 메컴 속이 제시 속이 제 매징 추베 시베 추바니 시고라 마돌라 머주 시베 니에바니 나고 예체메 문로베 빼다다요 마이노 시베 통노 세르바 나고디 텐조시 시고디 링데지에로와 다 머주 시베 예바데는 텐조로요 마 추시 예바데 링데지요 마 디베다 인치제 테나요 마서 들라와야 뭐 이제 기다는 다 아니 믹소 이네 야만 통한다고 야만 건조 초고스 디데게제 그 말이지.
And so if visible form, for instance, is, how should I say, found as intrinsically existent, and that perception is a valid perception, that is acceptable to the Baba Vivekas, but then it's not acceptable to the Chandrakriti, isn't it? And when the Chandrakriti says that there isn't intrinsically, you cannot find a form of whatever as intrinsically existent, now that is acceptable to the Prasangikas, but then that is not acceptable to the Baba Vivekas, isn't it? So again, there is no common ground here.
So, Maju and the Tono de Mangusun to Jerry and a young Jay in Majang. Then the Nayu Ranzella Maju, Musum, Musum Sama, the Shivu Ranzella Maju, Jebat Samaniga, the Shagui loss. Sita Maju, said in a Teresica, Nayu Ranzella Maju, that's Sundi Messi, the Ranzin is or say, Shivu Ranzella Maju, and that. Dammetava Senandi, only to be Jevata Hotel Shagris. The Ranju Danako, knowing the Hugh Kalun, Madu, and Joe Spena, Musun Samaina, no you to the Cosima, my Rua, Jevaina, Hugh Truson, some of my Rua. Said that tell you a Hugh to Sema is a Hidden Goro, or said that the Ranzesia the Teres, Yaman, no you Madua, Yaman, Hugh Madua, could they Karuji Mena? In ko yuto be lo shato marwa o ti sigo
no so tan ken shuna tan di kaso ore nguso mina ro wage rang na yu lo ma thu ba da tok pa ne sin yu lo ma thu se jo wage
o ti da rong ji be de so da rong ji lo sin na
ro ba
nguso mi chen je le na yu lo ma thu ba rong ji ba ganga de mare ta ling de ji sha ro ba da ba de da en tokwa ine hil ma do tinje jimena en ko chemare to ko
ma ro ani dan thank you bol dita cha go ma
thank you ge hil chu na hil chu na chema sha do ro
ala sin yul chu na yul chu na ala chema sha ro
sha chu o ti sha chu ko inda tuksa de tine to go
no So according to Baba Viveka, so when we say Baba Viveka, so don't take it as Geshe just kind of now clarified, mean that all Savatandika Madhyamigans, right? Savatandika Madhyamigans who are, let's say, with Baba Viveka. Yeah. So Baba Viveka, when we talk about Brahmana or valid cognitions, Sema, we can think of two types of valid cognitions. There is the direct valid cognitions, Ngusum Sema, and these are valid with regard to the appearing objects, Nangyur. Okay? They are valid or unmistaken with regard to their appearing objects. If they are not valid to the appearing objects, then they cannot be direct valid cognitions. Are you with me? Then there are inferential valid cognitions, right? Chebasema. And these have to be valid with regard to their referent objects or shenyu. If they are mistaken to their referent objects, then they cannot be valid. Okay? That's what the Baba Viveka accepts, isn't it? Okay? But now, for Prasangika Madhyamikans, perceptions could be mistaken with regard to the appearing objects or the referent objects, but they could still be valid. It's possible, isn't it? So that's a very different standpoint, isn't it? Something could be mistaken with regard to the appearing object or the referent object, depending upon what kind of perception we have, but it could still be valid. So this is the big difference between, right, the Baba Viveka's standpoint and Prasangika's standpoint.
Tsema tendawa, ten mewe, madruwe, shebe nyewe, tong, chöjeng de merongo. De rang singi jeba ne, Tokyo wa tang dewa tar, tong sheba, konar sheba menjis. Rangze siya ta nganzu, Tokyo wa se, di Tokyo se, di sigo se. Tang do deba to sigo, kanzi, tsema pal cheba rangze siya jorwa. O disu, tsema pal cheba rangze siya jida. Rang singi cheba rangze siya jorwa. Tadi tadi rangze siya de, kanzi ngobo rangze siya rangze de mares. O disu, kanzi, Tokyo cheba rangze de ngobo rangze siya derwa. Di rangze de kanzi ngobo ngumi kare ina gangal chab dengi deres. Kanzi yuishi rangze chob siya jorwa. O di rangze de rama, ina do dewe ngobo rangze ina siya de, o di mares. O di rang singi cheba rangze de res. O di maja.
So the Rangsen, which we translate as literally characteristic existence, or in this context we translate as intrinsic existence, it is not the same as characteristic existence or the Rangsen accepted by the Sautantikas school of thought. For Sautantikas, any functional phenomena, anything that's produced or functional, is called characteristic existence, phenomena. But here the characteristic existence of Rangsen, intrinsic, which we translated, is much more pervasive. It pervades everything that exists, right? That's the assumption. Baba Viveka says that if something exists, we call it a phenomenon or dharma, that it must exist characteristically or intrinsically. Okay? So the notion of characteristic existence or Rangsen in the Sautantika schools of thought and in the Baba Viveka's school of thought is a very different notion here.
What is here? The corner to a day, Rogi Lugi, Tsema, Tinde, Chujin, loss of Mother Day, go on, you get Julas, make the souls of a jay. And the time you Tsema, never there were men, was that Chujin to whom to say, it makes so to whom to say, chickens and 2 years here. Siya the killing, she gets a remodoshi, Coronal and Pumba in the time, dual career, the Ganga Cemetery, or did Marva, Killer, did the mother. For some let the do the other Pubato with some thank you, Julia, and Digi, selling your Tikago Marva. Got the tomato. That you did when you kill Lindation and then round thing you will take you to this or just say to know you was go. Shame of the you got the job they can you got hungry make Sigma don't Sigma.
So when the whole debate about there is no common subject or subject from common perspective, Chögyam Trungpa, the whole debate is about how does something exist? What is its final modes of existence, ultimate, right? That's the question. Not whether that something exists or not, right? If Baba Viveka and Chandrakirti look at the table, they both agree that's a table, right? They're not going to like, oh, that's not a table, right? That's a jug. They're not going to say that. That's a table. But now the issue is, if that's a table, how does it exist? Well, Baba Viveka insists that it exists intrinsically, and Chandrakirti says, no, it does not exist intrinsically. So the debate is, right, how does it actually exist? That is the crux of the matter, and they don't find a common ground on that level. Otherwise, they both use the table, they both can drink the water or tea or coffee, whatever. Geshe didn't say that. I just throw in all the common examples. And they're not going to say, well, I'm not drinking coffee. Well, they're drinking coffee, But the issue is, how do things actually exist? So one insists intrinsically, and other said not at all. And that's the debate. Okay?
Let's start this that try in
And we will stop there today, and we welcome your questions and observations, page 263, or any clarifications we need to make. Yes. Okay, go, Robert.
Good morning.
Yes.
Geshe. Okay. Let's say you have something simple as 1 plus 1 is 2.
Yes.
Okay, simple.
Yes.
And you're having a debate with somebody,
Yes.
Baba Viveka.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. It is 1 plus 1 is 2.
Right.
And he is saying no, it's 3.
Right.
Obviously,
Right.
humbly, he is
Somebody's
incorrect.
wrong, right? Yes.
How do you extinguish the argument or the debate? How many times do you go around and around if you
Right.
know ultimately
Right, right.
you are correct and
Right.
he is
Right. Somebody
incorrect?
is right, somebody's wrong, right? Yeah.
Absolutely. And how do you do that patiently, with compassion and with respect?
Sure, sure.
To just say, all right, that's it.
Right. I got it. Okay. Koran kandi shwe de dire gen. Ta karso tinin cheba ro de rwa gen.
Yes.
Karso da chig se de rang chini ki dub yor slab go rwa gen le chig se de yo mar slab rwa gen. Ani ago yang go jab dang cha rwa chig yo re slab chig yo mar slab ta di chi de ko tha ma so na rwa gen. Ta chig re de re chig de dig yo mar rwa gen. Ta ko ni pa she su she ko ra jab dang rwa gen. Ta di nga zo ina tablang ma so zoya ro ko de yo so rwa gen. Cheba de rwa gen. Ta koran ke be di de be na nga zo ta chi dang ke se she na ke chig de chig dom na ni rwa gen. Ta ni imba da rwa ta chig mar ke chig de chig dom ke sum res lam na rwa gen. Ta chig no do yo rwa gen. sum re la ke no do ri ne ta di kushab da dem be ton rwa gen. Ta di mang ba che ko de pa che su che de ko rwa gen. Kar so or mi su ba la rwa ro jo rwa gen. Kar ta che rwa ta mi sum ni mar rwa ta ni rwa gen. Chi de ko an kan ta di kar la or gen. Se ba da ba so che sam rwa de kan de sha go rwa gen. Ka di ta chu go ro so. Chig chig dom sum re sum me ba ti rwa gen.
That they they that talk and the that dancing was your
No.
what tickle to her.
No.
That could chick Zumba, chick the way, no? Yes, they couldn't got you share your that contributed in the Zumba the person goes in the mud the tongue as you
No. Ne.
what the night that they when you kill on the menda or the and move needle gun back get a shame. So I've done it two news on. In the request that the desert was at the Gyeltsen share of the Hamba share the say maybe the doll to when he took your so the request gives the Zakaran Chiden here my you don't got the book as the share die of Mara. But you just like it doesn't got the book in Pasha so the Yoro. The Yoma said the request the gill the son Takana share. So the third the mother regret you go, Resta. Take a share.
No, so.
that shit she go.
No.
That shit she go. The Kojo Kanta was the Tatu Dilla in the Mubokoro, Nezan Karina. Tickle and Doto.
So Geshe says that, let's say even working with your example, which is really fine, 1 plus 1 is 2, or somebody says 3. Well, so, how do we resolve that? At what point, out of respect, because somebody insists it's 3, well, somebody's wrong, and the way this decision comes is, through debate, honest debate, based upon facts and reasoning, we really think that at the end of however long it takes process going through that, the truth will come out. The fact has to speak, whatever the fact is. Of course, different people might have different ideas about the fact. Sometimes you got part of it right, part of it wrong. But based upon reasoning, it's not like somebody is very good with the rhetorical game. You are a big mouth, and you can really say the Danish thing, and then you kind of insist that no. We just have to be very honest. If really the reason that somebody provides is a very infallible, valid reasoning, right? Then we accept and we yield, and that's how the debate goes, isn't it? It's not imposing one's view on each other. It's not using some power, privilege to, affect the changes. It's just the facts. Facts before us, the power of the facts, as we say, and the critical reasoning and thinking, and basically it's the reason. Right, the valid reason. Whoever brings the valid kind of, how should we say, good valid reasons, so we decide on that and move forward.
But in my world,
right,
in my people don't stop arguing.
Right.
So how do you just walk away? How
Ah,
would he walk
right,
away? Just
sure.
patiently
Right.
and like,
That's right, right.
That's it, okay?
Yes.
You know,
Okay.
you essentially bow down so you don't
Right.
hurt their feelings and say,
Okay.
okay,
Right.
we'll agree to disagree.
All right.
But
Okay, now I got it. Yes.
That's not gonna
Okay.
solve the problem.
Okay, so your question is really, yeah, more from sociological point of view, not to really decide who is right or wrong. We just kind of, hey. Okay, I got it. 알아 고난 주에디 디르 도게 다지 소바츠네 베나 타기르 와치 찍돔나 니레 찍돔 숨으라 라와게 다고 타쉐 기게제데 마다로 와게 다디 단다 갱 송아데 당 가송네 가서 뭐벌 닥샤제로 와게 리바 양다 단 루고로 와게 다 지소나 데데고 미카신 고 타고 된데도 와게 고 돌로 담네 가레데 인랑에 저로 와 단디 토베고로 요마로 와서 와 한 콜라다 쿠샤데 데메 고네 와게 간데 서비스 봐. 제 잡던 제 사요 말어봐. 투보 그거 봐. 다 투보 마고 이제 안에 간데스 파유도 그래. 간데스 다 믿음어서네 참두용 강안에로 와게. 가르쳐 그거라서 그게.
네네. 근데 사진에다가 최분 제지기도 성을 시켜줘도 제가 로마디 자 카드고도 그런 선수에서 때 도단 유도 송니 잠으로 송셔로. 다 간좀 유주를 때 성을 그 지금 영 수요용야지 용거로 와. 디가다라다 됐나 이시 알리 드레노로메나 알리 제야야 마샤야라. 저때 타도 리바 제가 그래서 가서 됐으기도 와. 우제 생겨진동세야 시기도 와. 그래서 오메타와 여부텔 봐 남제 리바도 거르세. 남제 리바면 엄마 주고 러지메 인세나 페도가 해버리고로. 제가 땡스 리바 남자들 시부 계시고 있어요. 호텔에다. 호텔.
Well, Geshe said, in that case, you're right. We can be as diplomatic and kind and as possible, as sane and humanly, and just kind of, let it be, or maybe change the topic or whatever, because nothing is going to work. It's just going to, exacerbate the situation, and and sometimes, maybe in this particular situation, somebody is just like a rock and nothing happened. But then in another situation, that person might, be more kind of open, right? So depending upon things, so we look at other factors, say, is something, can we have a conversation decent? If not, just let it be, But we are not here to decide, anything here. So that's why, and oftentimes we say the Buddha taught as many as 84,000 discourses, right? Why Buddha had to talk too many things like that? But because people have different attitudes, different mental dispositions, different capacities, and sometimes even Buddha kind of said what's agreeable to them. He was like, yeah, that's right. Geshe didn't say, yeah, things exist truly. Okay, go with that. Until you're okay, they're like, well, really, last time I didn't mean that. Really, they don't exist truly. But so depending upon under circumstances, for different reasons, purpose, Buddha said things which seem very contradictory to different people, right? To appease it or to give them a chance to rethink, whatever, right? So those are the skillful means, right? So we are not going to bump our head into each other and do that. Just respectfully, we change the topic or thing like that. So that's why in the monastic universities, education curriculum, they talk about this expression that when you study even middle way philosophy, madhyamik, right, and where really we talk about things don't exist intrinsically, truly, whatever, madhyamik in philosophy and reasoning, whatever is there, is not enough. You really need to study the Pramana Vartika, valid cognition treatises, where we talk about what is valid cognition, right, and the perfect reasoning, syllogistic, all of those things. So you really need to combine them together to be able to be effective in your argumentations and things like that. So, yeah. So that's a good question. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That's, any other thoughts? Yeah, Bob, yeah.
I turned it off.
Yeah. I think it's on. Yeah.
Is it on?
It is on.
Okay, so the question I have is, and I don't even know if I can phrase it
Sure.
correctly,
Okay.
is on a conventional level,
Yes.
vase is a produced phenomena, but an ordinary person perceives it as essentially existing. And Baba Viveka,
Yes.
he sees it that way. But doesn't he say that conventionally, it has essential existence because by convention, everybody labels it a vase. But ultimately, because it's a produced phenomena, how does he
Say it exists, right?
say that it exists
It-
essentially
sure.
because it's a produced phenomena?
Sure.
That's
Okay.
what I don't understand.
Thank you. I got it clear. Yeah, what you said. Quran can show the dire again. Da karso gore pena ngaza taja tumon ne so gore wage. Pena pumba ina karena ro wa.
어디.
상대 pumba 스톤다 pumba 이방 워싱 거래 고 pumba 레스 밍다 하신 거래 고 하고 gore wage. 제가 고 타니에게 왕도 체면나 그래서 보고도 전에 고 pumba 밍다 하셔로 pumba 젤레 지고 다 상매로 wage.
어디.
고 비게 문에 지 도도를 지어버치러 wage.
어디.
다 상매 문에 지고로 와서 다 딜라다 욕라 매대가 wage.
어디.
안 코 가리스 때 분바대야 규제 망부지기 제베저로 왔게 다 단다 로벤 랭덴식으로 와게 그런저도 변하다 분바 가서 규제를 된 루바로 와게 때 켈링 이나로 와게 아니 디 랑기 신이 루버스 컨디션 거라서 와게 그때는 루버로 와게 규제기 제베레 제사워절로 와게 진짜 분바 똑다 제베다 상면 켈링 거로 왔게 여러 개미도 와 다이네 그 규제기 제베레 때는 루버절 단다 랑기 신이 루버랑은 루버스 컨디션 거라서 게 데 고걸 쳐መስ어
알레 데데 데스워다 가르사 롱 생이기 모두 두제 타르트 월 네지 타르트 원진 버스야지 무대 어디 다그 소소도 고알레나 저를 차고라다
나래
플라지과이나 롱이 메지 데데 인신제도 코롱은 유고도 데베나 그게 가르사다 베 리본라나 힘이고
나래
땡사 샤그문도 상거다
나로
저
나래
다 땡겨봤는데 다 땡제셔야 될 그게 똑바로 딱 좀 샤고라 데 샤고에서 이네 란데 저서나 유코노 축도 때문에 접고도 셔다 땡제다 이네 란데 좋아인데 겨와도세 땡겨 따던데 따오라
나래
다 런지 뭐지 따던데 땡데이나 스위드한테 요고도
나래
어디면 이렇게 다가서 르바지 레서서 롬샤마도 그 누구가 저시야 요 말로 왔어
나래
시즌 디펜트 문도
나래 다 그래 땡데기 고전 탈라셔
근데 그거던데 다 내려와 내리잖아 샘자마도 그 유연된데서 하면 그 쇼가가 된데 켈링 말아
나오
다 런지바가 디켈링 거야 저 뼈도 된데 켈링 거로 와
나래
다 tenjuwaga tiga tewaga tope taksum dende se shagmunde
나오
o ta de tewade dende shagwa de se mendawa bajide tenjuwa ji de dende khede lingire di tenjuwa da ngante dende ri se demire se kwa chu de kawalingor se na tope taksum lingora
노노노 다 랑주베기 또바 딱 비슷하게 켈링 거로 와게
tope taksum keling mare
아 제가 말 와게
a so keling mare se tope taksum ina
Hamada
ramon
gendi-
mego do se gore
디 말와게 그래서 게 남지디 세칭이 셔도 가로 와게 로나멜라 나외 뭔가 샤워 마이 뭐 유랑 그 투모 마이 누른 건 주발로 디 따고 또바 따고 켈링 거 말게
tope taksum keling mare
마 똑베 따고서 잠면다게 똑베 따고 켈링 거로 용
tabat keling tabe ta se na ta tope
tabat
zimba
samda de yomar ta.
zimba sha shu
알로
ro samslana
알로 잠바디
다 또가 그런 뭐도 피게 매워셔. 다 거기 저주 놓으시는 이거 뭘지 요거.
요거 삼다디 제 맞지 저
어디래?
So Geshe said, that whole the complexity of what you just kind of highlighted, it has to do with the different understanding and the notions of what dependent arising means, right? Tendel, pratit samutpad. And so for the Savatandika Madhyamikans, there is no contradiction between, for them, the way they understood it, explained is, that something can exist dependently, but also intrinsically. That is their, understanding, level understanding what dependent arising means. Whereas for the Prasangikas, if something exists dependently, then it could not exist intrinsically, right? At a much deeper level. So because of that, so Prasangikas would use the dependent arising to refute intrinsic reality, and the Savatandika Madhyamika Baba Viveka would use dependent arising to establish that things exist intrinsically. They're using the same reasoning with a different understanding of what it is. So that's why the complexity of things, as you said, we struggle with that. Because, let's say, there are three different levels of what dependent arising means. The one is a very basic, fundamental, which is dependent upon causes and conditions, isn't it? Jujenji tender, right? And the Chita Martins or mind-only school accept that, cause and effect relationship condition, right? That's one level, okay, very basic fundamental. And then the Sevatantrika Madhyamikans like Baba Viveka, in addition to that cause and effect relationship, they also accept dependent arising in terms of relativity, isn't it? Things are connected, related to each other, right? This and that, right? And here and there, that kind of, right? They are not cause and effect kind of relationship, but it's here and there, right? So that kind of dependent arising they accept. And they do accept a conceptual imputation. But the Prasangika Madhyamikans are the ones who accept all of those, but they really, basically, when they say dependent arising, they don't mean so much the cause and effect dependent arising or the relativity. They really mean merely labeled, right? Some, merely is really very instrumental in the Tibetan technical term. We always find it hard to translate English, right? Things are labeled. Not only labeled, they're merely labeled, right? I don't know how much sense we can convey through this English word, but some, okay? And so according to Baba Viveka, things are labeled, but not merely labeled, because they said, then why can't the rabbits have a horn on the head? We can just label it, horn on the rabbit head. Why can't it come true, right? They said, for things to exist, something must exist essentially from its side, right? It's a combination of things, it is subject and object. Something exists from its side, something is labeled under it. Through that combination, they exist. So if something exists from its side, it should be findable under analysis, right? We look for it. You can say, yeah, there it is, isn't it? So that's their understanding of dependent arising. Something is labeled, right? Vase is labeled, anything is labeled, but it's not merely labeled because there is something about the vase that is intrinsic, in nature. Are you with me so far? Okay. So the dependent arising does not negate the intrinsic reality for them. Actually, it asserts the intrinsic reality. Prasangika Madhyamikans say, no, nothing is findable. It's just merely label. Everything is nothing but a mere labels, And that's such a subtle interpretation of what dependent arising is. And so that therefore, from that perspective, Prasangika's perspective, nothing can and does exist intrinsically. And there is nothing, even teeny weeny bit out there. It's just a label, onto things. So that's where we struggle, how they use the same reasoning but with different notion, and really antithetical, isn't it? One says things don't exist intrinsically, dependent arising, right? Others say, no, they exist intrinsically, dependent arising. So that's the, where we have the, a struggle there to understand. Yeah. So for Baba Viveka, things are not just merely labeled. Something has to be there, isn't it? If we say table is a label plus there's something, that's essentially table. That's there, It has to be findable, okay? For Prasangika, it's a mere label. There's nothing there to find, Yes.
Merely, basically,
Yeah.
does it mean the same as nothing more than label?
Nothing more than label.
More straightforward way
Right,
of saying.
right.
Merely is nothing more than label.
Okay,
That's what merely means.
Right, let's check with each other, right? So again, 딱 삼세저로 와.
아니.
삼대 갈래서가 최담제 코 민라레마데 이제 시험에 요 말씀 고전 다가를 배서 민삼세 삼다저로 와게.
어리,
고선 간도 있는 딱 민삼레마더로 와. 디라 로스 직 개메데.
근데 딱 똑배 딱점스도 당연히 됐어요. 간제 딱점스는 이해하면 시작하죠. 다 똑배 딱점 봐야 그 유코랑 째는 이서나 똑배 딱점 차고 뭐 유코랑 원이 요루고 와.
네.
당금도 시커져지는 그런 바 째이나 범바세 동지 저 범바를 샤이나 범바에 다 범바가 카르베 샤르베세 인농지나 히드 째위나 범바된 데 샤르가 강가 파시나 범바 차고 말와.
네.
제도 그 분명히 유나 다 째다 근데 또 딩만 좀 데레셔서라고
딱거나게 베나베겐 쪽설 라바다가 이심지 샤션.
어때 샤디지고 다
게메베다 쪽설이 디 수르데 비게
어때 지야요 말이지 똑바로 데려다
但是跟俺这我的刚才听不是个大咱们在这个因为那民间的现在日本人民大是不是个？俺这边不找到就要个，是不是？他定要的就个，我日本人都找到做啥么子个？这当天的了个，他我这找到了就是你看来了个样个。
this is what that tell this is what that currently 저거는 this is what 와 타니베 세메면도 이제 타니디와 체조섬 국어로
나래.
제가 일본란 중에들 타니베 세마시니 문어세 상고마다 디미 또바당도 체지야 메시워 답베 루이다 루모니 루다바니 체지야요 말이다 말 요 말데 이나 그게 타니베 세메네 문어세 켜져레스 답베 루디 루리 삼는 거 류 샤시고 말아 세메 누구라 너 돈디지나 저와 자 류군에 됐어 이제 도 교시고로 그때 세메 줘야지 도와 시다 타집에 세마신이 넣으면 뭐도 또 그때도 지야 해요 말라고 다다pen 타바 류도 타바다 류군을 류도 타바 또 그때도 지고지 경셔
Don't worry, I understood everything he said. I'm just adding some more things to get more out of it if we possibly could. So again, they could do that. And the taxi sema ke share. The taxi sema.
taxi sema se ada ti는 rogo.
Taxi sema le bige ye dengar ke lagu maro. Taxi sema.
Da kahi taxi sema ye bas. Taxi sema ye bas de tsala ya. You go sha de shago wasa. Taxi sema se ada kare se. Da ko tides be do re something. Lozi ye na. ene tele sema shingne ba mindu na ene dagi sema ye ba su
ale ta shana digo ale
ta ko dyre sa du ta takwa dyre sa ta shana ene dagi sema ye ma ra du sha shi go ba ra dagi sema me ba su but it is good
okay welcome aboard so yes, in a sense that when we say merely label, there's nothing more than a label, right? And so then I was asking more. For example, we said table. I said, looks like there's more than a label. There's something there. You know, what is it? You know, so that's why Geshe said, you know, at some time ago we talked about this. There are three essential conditions, fulfilling conditions we talk about. Okay. That in the case of a coiled rope, it looks like a snake, right? And we call it a snake. And then we see a real snake next to it, we call it a snake, right? As far as labeling is concerned, it's exactly the same thing. There's nothing better, worse, anything. They are both merely, right? But the reason why that coiled rope really is not a snake is because there are other conventional valid cognitions that can contradict that, right? It's a rope, isn't it? With the real snake, you cannot, isn't it? So that's why that goes back to what we call the valid basis of imputation, dakshitsema, right? If the label is given onto a valid basis of labeling, dakshitsema, then it works fine. We call that a table, right? And it just works fine. Now, if I'm not satisfied with the label, we said, which is the table? You know, is that part or that part or the top flap or whatever, then nothing is findable, right? That's the issue. So by calling the table, no other conventional valid cognitions can contradict it, isn't it? Yeah, so that
that implies, when you talk about labels on the one hand and then valid basis of imputation on the other, that implies that the valid basis of imputation are not label, but they're also labels.
Yeah, that get dakshi sema se koran ke ko to ba ta sam ro ba se ke that se pa cha de ro ba dakshi sema la de bi ko to se kan ta de be so de ma ro ko koran ya ke ta sam ro ba ke
dakshi se de ta koran shi de ta zhong se ren zhong ta di xing da di ya so zhong se ta ho ro ba ta dakshi de so de ro ba
la de
ta de dakshi de ga ta gang ba de ta ho re to ta ho zhe dang shi bo ro ba kan ji ge ne de ga
That's right, you're right. And that's what Vasankeka would say. Even the basis of labeling is a merely label, isn't it? A collection of all these things make it a table basis, right? But it's, again, merely label thing. Right? Yeah.
So basically, only labels exist.
Only
That's
labels
what we're saying.
exist. Right, exactly. Yeah. There's nothing intrinsic.
So nothing of what we see, nothing of what we see actually exists whatsoever, because we don't see labels. We don't see labels.
It's not so much nothing what we see doesn't. It means nothing exists just the way we see it, right?
Well, but if only labels
the way
exist,
we see is like
we don't see labels.
Vladimir there,
yeah,
like a very independent person.
Yeah, you see a
there
form.
Is no,
it's some
right?
kind of a form.
Yeah.
You see a form. You don't see a label.
Right.
You see, which the
I see a
form,
form.
the conventional form that we see do not exist because we don't see labels.
Oh, yeah.
We don't. Besides, labels appear only to conceptual consciousness.
Right, yes.
So that means that whatever we see does not exist. Nothing that appears to sensory consciousness exists because it's not a label. A label can be perceived only by conceptual.
I got your argument. I'm going to, yes, I got, yeah. I'll go on this go again. Karso Ranganzo, talk about thousand studio Yata, Karso or the Shebe and Simon talk about again. Zadorwage, Kaso, Muslim did what the Tiage, Omar Rosa, Tabana, near Kotongo or Quiming, let me studio Gala, me, but in a talk by Hago mother, near Tom, they could shoot from their mother, Yomar Wage. Studio Gala says, I'm the only Shabalia. And this is the only happen. Talk about tax. I mean, only Sheba to get the church. I am made in a chat. Only Sheba to tag you again.
这是当我这，我们希望可能通的话，这个这个是吧？但我们希望可能通怎么就是得来瞧我现在还有嘛对吧？但多半的所有都刚刚从给都会说了，是吧？
那么或者什么第三个是了，往些个大概没上了哇个，往些我这就个没定，但是多半大上面那了哇个，往边就通的个嘛，大概有吧哇个，确实没定了差不多。
这差过嘛？这个是。我多半当时委外他个人个安心从那他个那个委外他个多的嘛意思，我安心特别多要下药嘛是吧？多半都是可能安心了通过，他个人真的嘛是吧？
如果看得通的话了。
真的嘛是吧？
It says in the case of our sensory perceptions, right, they don't have the ability to label or deal with that. That's a conceptual framework. So they simply see whatever it is, you know. The eye sees that as a table, and that's all it is, you know. And only when we label it as a table, right, then we have a recognition. Otherwise, it just simply sees, right? That, yeah.
This is been chosen the 그런 것도 왜 다성 리고로와 얘도 왜 다성 리고로와 이게 왔으면 돼와 이거 얘도 왜 다성 누다 그런 것도 왜 다성 많이 해볼까요 말와 그리고 니제도 가져서는 얘도 왜 근데 딱섬 좀 요 말이지 딱 그것도 왜 딱섬 요 말이지 그런 세도 될 나와 요 말이지 와와 어떻게 통만 되게
Yeah, so I mean in this ground, like say we all agree or label that's a table in a particular language, right? So I mean, from your perspective, that is a table. From my perspective, concept, that's a table, right? We agree upon that. You know, and there's nothing more than that label, you know. So we have that agreement, you know. Yeah, so it is like no more than labels. Any other thoughts? Oh, we have to stop there, sorry. This quarter past, so they have to go to funeral, I'm sorry, as I announced, that they can charge us. So I will do the short dedication again.
Sanje shende me de vewa ye droge nanda sheba jo kan re ra ve ho ve xin gan de den dan de wa ma ve zhong ve ne chen re se wan den zhen ya zo ye sha ve se de ten yu je ye dang gu ro ra na man de la gan ni yan da ya